Okay,
you
it's my
know,
pleasure.
the information about kind of a forthcoming conference.
Okay, that would be great.
Are you familiar with معهد دراسات في البحرين؟ عندك يعني معلومات عنه؟
Trends, yeah, I follow them I follow their articles and their studies. They produce valuable studies about
Yeah.
about Muslim Brotherhood, mainly in the West, because as you know, recently, Muslim Brotherhood has no power in Middle East. They are afraid from their influence in the United States.
But they are very, very highly influential out of the Middle East. That's the problem.
Yeah, I'm agree with you. They now working underground like before. And after 30, 40 years, they will become in the power again. And so on, and so on, and so on.
So on and so on, yeah. So how do you see actually things in Egypt regarding that?
I can say Sisi is fully controls the scene in Egypt now. But Mubarak did that before, but after 10 years, what will happen? Nobody can predict.
Nobody knows, yeah.
Yeah, because you know, after 10 years, the Sisi will become old. He already has a problem with some general in the army. And who knows?
Yeah, it's a cycle, I know.
You know,
Vicious cycle.
it's a cycle, Middle Eastern cycle, we can say that.
But don't you think that there are a group of states in the Middle East that have decided actually not to let those religionist professional troublemakers to get into politics? I mean, this is something we do see in Emirat, in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, maybe Morocco to some extent. So I think that there is a bunch of states who did declare that this is not actually their, you know, they wouldn't have that one way or the other. So they outlawed them, at least when it comes to the Emirat and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
And Egypt, yeah, it's yeah, they are in the same side. You can say they are a coalition against the Muslim Brothers, but we shouldn't forget the power of the Muslim Brothers in the West. And the Muslim Brothers get the power when they get a case of life from the American administration. So, are there any guarantees that we will not have in the future another Obama?
Nope, I agree with you.
Yeah, so
yeah. Look at what's going on these days in the States. It's
you know, but listen, bro, I have an opinion. Now, the situation in Middle East is better than before because there is a direct coalition and cooperation between Israel and moderate Sunni countries.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Welcome. We're going to start.
Yeah.
So everybody, welcome back. So we have, I think, 3 very important speakers for this session. Each speaker can speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So I'm very happy and honored to welcome back Professor Benny Morris. Professor Morris is a professor of history at Ben-Gurion University in Israel. And the title of his talk is A Fresh Look at the 1948 War, the First Arab-Israeli War. After Benny, we'll have Professor Uzi Rabi. Uzi is the director of the Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. And his lecture is Israel and the Middle East 2021, Pandemic and Geopolitics. And then we have Ramy Aziz, and Ramy will be the 3rd speaker, and he's speaking about the link between the Palestinian cause and the spread of anti-Semitism. So Benny, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Well, the 1948 war, the first Arab-Israeli war, it was probably the most important, historically significant of the wars between Israel and the Arab states around. It changed the geopolitics. Why was it important? Why, in retrospect, can it be seen as the most significant of the wars? It changed the geopolitics of the region in 2 ways. One certainly major, and the other questionably major. The certain one is that it planted a Jewish state in the middle of the Arab and Muslim world, in a world stretching from Morocco to the Arabian Gulf. In the middle, it planted the state of Israel, which in fact divides the Arab world in 2, the East and the West, and the Muslim world in 2. And this remains a standing problem for many Arabs and many Muslims. The second problem, or the second reason for the significance of that war is that it created a refugee problem, which is still with us today, the Palestinian refugee problem, and it remains a major bone of contention between Israel and the Arab world, Israel and the Palestinians, and probably is the most significant obstacle to reaching, or certainly is one of the most significant obstacles to reaching an Israeli-Palestinian accommodation. The war was the result, the 48 war broke out, it was the result of 70 years of growing or gradually growing conflict between the Arab inhabitants of the land of Israel or Palestine and the incoming Zionist settlers who gradually arrived in the country from the 1880s onwards. And there were bouts of conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in the country starting in 1920. Each bout of conflict was greater or larger than the one previously in 1921, 1929, 1936, 39. And then you had this explosion, which was the 48 war. It was triggered by the passage by the United Nations General Assembly of a resolution embodying, in fact, the view of the international community that a solution, a just solution to the problem of Palestine, the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine, was a partition of the country into two states. The Arabs of Palestine and then the Arab states around it rejected this resolution by the UN General Assembly and then launched hostilities in two stages against the Jewish community and then the state of Israel, which was born in May 1948. The war ended with Jewish victory. The war can be divided. It's worth remembering it actually was a war which naturally divided into two parts, two halves. The first half was between the two communities in Palestine, the Jews and the Arabs, while the British were officially still the governors of the land. The British only departed in the country on the 14th of May 1948. The conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine, launched by the Palestinian Arabs, began in November 1947 and ended with a Palestinian defeat in May 1948. And then the second stage of the war, which was between Israel and the Arab states, began in the day after the Jews in Palestine declared themselves declared statehood on the 14th of May. On the 15th of May, the armies of the Arab states around Israel invaded the country, most of them attacking the Jewish state, and this ended in their defeat. This war between the states, the second part of the 48 war, ended in the defeat of the Arab states by 1949. Now, I've looked at the war for the past 30 years. I've written a number of books about the Palestinian refugee problem. In 2008, I wrote a book called 1948, which sort of summarized, if you like, the war. And what I'm going to give you now is a number of the conclusions I reached in that book. The first one relates to the nature of the war. It's been conventional wisdom that the war in Palestine in 1948 was a territorial political war between the Arabs of Palestine and the Jews of Palestine, and then the Arabs were joined by the Arab states, but it was over the territory of Palestine or parts of the territory of Palestine. Looking through the documentation, which I researched for that book, I arrived at the conclusion that the war was of course, a political war between two national movements desiring sovereignty over the land of Israel or Palestine, but it was also a war of culture and religion. From the Arab side, the war was seen as a war of religion, a holy war, if you like, a jihad against the infidel invader, the Zionists or the Jews. This conclusion of mine is disputed by some historians, but I think I found sufficient evidence that in the minds of the prosecutors of that war, the Arabs, they took it for granted that it was a holy war, in addition to being a political war. On the 1st of December, 1947, 3 days after the UN passed its partition resolution, 1st of December 47, the Ulama of Al-Azhar University, that is the Council of Wise Men, theologians, if you like, of Al-Azhar University, which in Cairo, which is, of course, the oldest university in the Arab world, and its Council of Theologians is seen as the most important interpreter of Islam in the Sunni Arab world. This council, the Ulama of Al-Azhar, on the 1st of December declared jihad against the Zionist enterprise, calling upon Muslims who are able-bodied to come and fight against the Zionists. And if they weren't able, they should at least send donations to support the struggle against the Zionists. The Ulama of Al-Azhar repeated this fatwa, this declaration or interpretation of the law in Islam. It repeated this fatwa, this ruling, in April 1948, on the eve of the Pan-Arab invasion, which included, of course, the army of Egypt, of Palestine. In other words, they wanted to egg on, if you like, the Arab states, and especially King Farouk of Egypt, to see through with his declarations that he intended to go to war, to actually carry out the invasion. And so in April, they reiterated the fatwa, calling for jihad against the Zionists in Palestine. They reiterated the fatwa once more in December 1948, by which time the Arabs had already lost the war. The Arab states had lost the war, principally Egypt had lost in the hostilities against the Israeli army. But they repeated it in December, basically saying, we've lost this round, but jihad is still the obligation of Muslims, of the Arab states, and of all Muslims to continue this for, if you like, a second round and a third round. Of course, they didn't say that. They weren't going to concede that they had already been defeated in December, but this was the import of what they reiterated in December 48. This is an illustration, if you like, of the jihadi impetus for the war. But let me give you something from the ground that is more connected, if you like, to what was happening in Palestine. In January 1948, in other words, 2 months after the jihad had been declared, 2 months after the militias of the Arabs in Palestine had begun to attack the Jewish settlements and traffic in Palestine, a woman called Matiel Muranam, who was a Lebanese Christian married to a Palestine Arab and lived in Jerusalem. She'd moved to Jerusalem after marrying this man, and she headed the women's organization of the Arab Higher Committee. That is, the Arab Higher Committee was, if you like, the governing body of the Palestine National Movement, headed by Haj Amin al-Husseini. It had a small women's section called the Women's Organization, the Palestine Women's Organization, and this Christian woman from Lebanon, Matiel Muranam, headed it. In January 1948, she gave an interview in which she said the following: "The UN decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred." If a Christian woman from Lebanon was saying this in January 1948, that the Arabs were engaged in a holy Islamic war, it can be taken for as obvious and evidence, if you like, that this was in the minds of the Arabs of Palestine. And if you like, we have other evidence about King Farouk and Abdullah also relating to this as a holy war, in addition to being, if you like, a political war. A second conclusion, or a second set of conclusions reached in my book was about the war aims of the various sides. And here there may be a few surprises for those not conversant with the full story. On the Jewish side, the principal aim of the Jewish side in the war was survival. So it was in the first half of the war, in the battle between the Jewish and Arab militias in Palestine, survival of the Jewish Zionist enterprise. And so it was after the declaration of statehood on the 14th of May and after the 15th of May invasion in 48 of the newborn state by the Arab armies. The principal aim of the Jewish side was survival, that the state should weather the storm and survive. To the Jewish side accrued two additional war aims, one of which I think historians do not dispute, and the second of which is disputed by some historians. The second of the war aims, in addition to survival, was from April 1948 on, the leadership of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Palestine, wanted as a war aim, the expansion of the territory of the Jewish state as outlined by the United Nations Partition Resolution. The Partition Resolution had awarded the Jews something like 55% of the landmass of Palestine. The war ended with the Jews occupying 80% of Palestine. And this was this was a result of this being policy and the war aim of the Yishuv leadership to expand the territory of the emergent Jewish state, if you like, at the expense of what had been allocated to the Palestine Arabs in the UN partition resolution. The third war aim, and here we enter, as I say, disputed territory, was certainly for Ben-Gurion and others in the leadership, though not necessarily agreed upon by all the leadership, and it wasn't official government policy, but it was to reduce the number of Arabs who would remain in the area of the Jewish state as it emerged. In other words, they wanted less Arabs to remain in the Jewish state. This is fairly understandable. The Arabs had essentially rejected the UN partition resolution, the solution which was seen as fair, and had gone to war against the Jewish state. They could be expected to be disloyal citizens of the Jewish state. Were they absorbed into the Jewish state? Were they to remain in the Jewish state as citizens? And Ben-Gurion and others wanted to diminish their numbers. And this, in fact, happened, if you like, in the sense of the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, which saw most of the Arabs who had lived in the territory which became the Jewish state uprooted and departing, leaving the area of that state. But as I say, there are historians who dispute this. They say that the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem was just an accident of war. It wasn't intended. There was nothing. What I'm saying is it wasn't official policy, but there were leaders, including Ben-Gurion, who wanted it to happen, and it happened. Less Arabs in the Jewish state as it emerged. When looking at the Arab side in terms of their war aims, and here we have a problem, we're talking about a number of different states, and before we talk about the states, we're talking about the Palestine Arabs, or the Arabs living in Palestine during that civil war part of the 48 war. And we have a problem in the sense that Arabs' archives are closed. The Palestinian Arabs produced basically no archives. The Arab states may have produced documentation and archives, but they're all closed, so we don't really know what's in them. What's in the archives, there may not be much there. Maybe in Jordan, there's good archives. In Egypt, there aren't any archives. We don't know. But in any case, all these archives are closed to researchers, independent researchers, and therefore we don't really know Arab war aims like we do know Jewish war aims. So we have the Jewish cabinet, the Zionist cabinet meetings. We have much of the military documentation. So we can follow what was in the minds of on the Israeli side in terms of policy, in terms of intentions, in terms of war aims. It's more difficult in terms of the Arabs. There are, of course, intelligence sources, intelligence material about the Arab side. There are diplomats in the Arab states, Western diplomats who send back reports about what King Abdullah of Jordan is thinking, or what King Farouk of Egypt is thinking, or what the prime minister in Egypt is thinking, what the intentions of the Arab armies are, etc. We have some material on all this, but it's much more meager, let's say, than understanding the Jewish side. But insofar as we can see, the Arab aims in the war are unclear. This, I think, would be the most correct way of putting it. The Palestine Arabs probably wanted, in entering hostilities against the emergent Jewish state between December 47 and May 1948, the leadership of the Palestine Arabs probably wanted to prevent the implementation of the partition resolution. In other words, to prevent the implementation, the creation of the establishment of a Jewish state. There would be chaos in the country. United Nations forces or great powers or Arab states would intervene and prevent the emergence of a Jewish state. This certainly was probably, or most likely was, the war aim, the major war aim of the Palestinian Arab side. It's doubtful whether they actually thought they could beat the Jews, but they did think they could create enough chaos to perhaps prevent the emergence of the Jewish state. The Jews believed that the Arabs of Palestine, as they believed that the Arab states themselves, wanted to push the Jews into the sea, or the Jews at least feared that this was the Arab war aim, to destroy the Yishuv, to destroy the Jewish community in Palestine, and to destroy the Jewish presence in Palestine. But this wasn't necessarily what the Palestinian Arabs aimed at. We don't know if that was their aim. It's not in the documentation, so we certainly can't. But as I say, the Jewish leadership and probably most Jews in Palestine believed, and this is following the Holocaust, 3 years after the Holocaust, they probably had good reason to fear this, that they were bound for slaughter. That is, this is what the Arabs of Palestine and maybe the Arab armies as well, once they invaded, intended for the Jews. The Arab states declared, if they declared anything, and some of them did, the Egyptian government declared on the day of invasion on the 15th of May, they declared that their aim was to enter the country to save the Palestine Arabs from the Jews, to save them from the terrorist Jews, as they put it, saying that the Arabs were being slaughtered by the Jews and we are intervening to save them. This may have been also in the minds of the Egyptian government, but it's probably more likely, and this is some evidence has emerged for that, that they intended to actually annex chunks of Palestine, especially the Negev, the southern Negev portion of Palestine or the state of Israel. They intended to annex that area for Egypt. This certainly was among their war aims. This also seems to have been a war aim of the Syrian government in the north, where its army invaded. They wanted to conquer apparently the area around the Sea of Galilee and incorporate it into the Syrian state. Certainly this is true about Jordan. The Jordanian army, which incidentally was the most efficient of the armies fighting in the 48 war on both sides, the Jordanian army entered what we call today the West Bank and occupied it in addition to East Jerusalem, with the aim essentially of annexing the West Bank and East Jerusalem to the Kingdom of Jordan. This was their main aim. The Arabs, of course, said that they were betraying the Arab cause because they didn't actually intend to and didn't attack the Jewish state. And this is true. The Jordanian army did not actually cross the lines which the UN had delineated in the partition resolution and attack any territory of the Jewish state. They entered the West Bank, they occupied the West Bank, later they annexed the West Bank formally, and they entered East Jerusalem, which hadn't been, of course, allotted to the Jews or the Arabs in the partition resolution, which had declared that the territory of Jerusalem and Bethlehem should be an international zone. But Jordan went ahead and occupied East Jerusalem, including the old city. So the occupation was certainly the agenda on the Jordanian side. On the other Arab states who invaded, it certainly included a territorial aggrandizement, occupying and annexing, if you like, territory, and it probably also included harming the Jewish state. Whether they intended the Arab states, Egypt, the governments of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, who had sent armies to invade Palestine, had they intended to throw the Jews into the sea to destroy the Jewish state? We don't know. Maybe the Jews were right that this was their intention, but this isn't in the documentation. And as I say, the Arab documentation is unavailable, so we don't know what they discussed and said among themselves in cabinet meetings, in orders to their army, in terms of what the objectives should be, etc. We don't know. A third element which I'd like to talk about in the short time which I'm allowed is to do with the refugee problems created by the 48 war. And I say problems which probably may raise some eyebrows, because we know about the refugee problem created among the Palestinians, wherein 700,000 Palestinians of perhaps 1.2 or 1.3 million Arabs who lived in Palestine, some 700,000 of them were uprooted and were removed or moved or fled or were expelled from the area which became the Jewish state, most of them into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and a minority of them out of the country altogether to Jordan, Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon. We know of that refugee problem, and the world knows it, and it still remains a refugee problem. Incidentally, the Arabs registered as Palestinian refugees in the United Nations, a number now something like 6 million. In other words, it's the descendants of those 700,000 plus their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. That's what makes up the 600,000, in addition to several tens of thousands of the original 700,000 who are probably still alive. But in addition to that, the war created two other refugee problems. The first, which nobody ever alludes to, is an Israeli Jewish refugee problem. In other words, 70,000 Jews of the Israeli or the Zionist community in Palestine, 70,000 of the 650,000 Jews who lived in Palestine at the start of the war, 70,000 of them, which is more than 10% of them, became refugees, were displaced from their homes, ended up living in empty school buildings or whatever in Tel Aviv and in Haifa. Most of them later were returned to their settlements or areas which were either held, continuously held by the Jewish side, or reoccupied by the Jewish side, or conquered by the Jewish side. And so that refugee problem dissolved at the end of 1948, beginning of 1949. But it's worth knowing that there were 70,000 Jewish refugees, and that's not a small number, 10%. If 10% of Americans were turned into refugees or uprooted from their homes today, you would end up with a refugee problem of 35 million. 35 million Americans would have become refugees. So we're talking about a substantial number of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Palestine, who became refugees. But as I say, the problem evaporated, disappeared, because they were rehoused in their old homes or new homes. In the case of Jews who had lived in the old city of Jerusalem, they were permanently exiled from the old city, which had been taken over by the Jordanians, and were rehoused in West Jerusalem, and that problem vanished altogether. The third refugee problem, and this one is more serious on the Jewish side, was of course the refugees, the Jewish communities in the Arab world became refugees. In other words, were uprooted from their homes in Libya, Egypt, Syria, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Yemen, Iraq. These Jewish communities, who numbered something like a million souls, all of them were uprooted from their homes in the wake of the 48 war. Some of them were uprooted during the 48 war. Many of them were uprooted immediately after the 48 war. And the Moroccan Jewish community, for example, one of the largest, gradually became uprooted and were, if you like, pushed out of their Arab world, out of the Arab world in the years up to 1964. By 1964, Moroccan Jewry, which numbered something like 400,000, had vanished. Today, there's maybe 2,000 Jews in Morocco. In places like Yemen, there's probably about 200 Jews. In a place like Baghdad, there may be 2 Jews. In Libya, I don't know if there's any Jews, but essentially all the Jewish communities in the Arab world were uprooted. Most of them arrived, meaning the poor, arrived in Israel and became citizens of the Jewish state. The minority of them, being the middle class and the wealthier Jews from Morocco, Tunisia, etc., ended up in France or in England. From Baghdad, they ended up in England and were resettled in the West. And thus the Jewish Arab refugees, the problem also evaporated because they were absorbed and became citizens of other countries, not wanting to go back to the Arab states. And this, of course, they are different from the Palestinian Arabs who want to go back to their homes. The Jewish refugees from the Arab lands don't. But in both cases, the communities lost enormous amounts of wealth as a result of being pushed out. The Jews from the Arab lands, incidentally, almost all of them weren't evicted by order of the government. There were no official expulsion orders, except in Egypt in 1956, but most of them were simply pushed out by the societies among whom they lived. They were seen as allies or secret allies of the Jewish cause, of the Israeli state, therefore potentially subversive or actually subversive of the Arab societies in which they lived. And there were, of course, pogroms in various places, like Morocco and Libya, other places, Syria, and this sort of pushed the Jews out and they fled. There was also a pull factor in this. The Jewish state wanted them to come to Israel, so they sort of called them to come. So in other words, there was a push from the Arab societies and governments, and there was a pull from the Jewish side for them to come to Israel, to leave their countries and come to Israel. One last thing I'll talk about, and that's very shortly because my time is run out, and that's the balance of forces between the sides in the 48 war. It's a contentious issue and also has a moral implication because Western liberals tend to side with the underdog, and the weaker side is always seen as the virtuous side, and the stronger side is seen as necessarily the aggressor and the evil one. The war in Palestine in both parts was won by the stronger side, contrary to what you may see when you look at maps or what you may hear in propaganda. But the stronger side, the Israeli side, was stronger, both stronger than the Palestinian Arabs in Palestine, their militias, and stronger, as it turned out, than the armies the Arabs had sent to fight as they invaded the country in May, June 1948. This had political consequences.
Sorry, Benny, could you try and wrap it up in a minute or so? Sorry.
I'm wrapping it up in 2 minutes.
Cool.
There's political consequences to this, and that was that the Jews managed to persuade, Israel managed to persuade the Western world that it had been the weaker party in this thing, and therefore was deserving of Western support, aid, etc. And this was one of the reasons in this presentation of the David Goliath picture that it received Western support, certainly American support, in the wake of the 48 war. Just one more sentence. Why was the Jewish side stronger? Because it mobilized properly, it mobilized its resources properly. It had experienced soldiers who had fought in wars, who came to its aid or were in Palestine already. The Arabs didn't have this. There was a sort of a sense of a motivation that they were being attacked and they might also suffer a second Holocaust. And this, of course, gave the Jewish side much greater motivation than the Arab side had as well. And there was an economic factor. The Jews benefited from enormous amounts of financial aid from American Jewry and world Jewry in general, and this helped them to wage the war. The Arab side was essentially poor, not like today, but it was very poor at the time and was unable to essentially finance its war aims. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Benny. Thank you. The next speaker is Uzi Rabi, who's the director of the preeminent research center on the Middle East at Tel Aviv University, the Dayan Center. Uzi, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. I mean, can I share my screen actually?
Yes. You should.
Yep. Okay, guys. Thanks for inviting me. I mean, it's a great pleasure to be here always. And good evening, everybody. What I would try to do is just to give you shortly kind of a picture of the geopolitical chessboard in the Middle East as being seen or perceived by Israel. I mean, what we got here is, you see, I mean, all this stuff that includes the Middle East, including Turkey and Iran, has become kind of a region that is going through a lot of suffering, but also experiencing, I would say, tectonic changes when it comes to the geopolitical chessboard. Shortly put, I would say that there are three main axes, or I would say three main directions through which to better analyze the Middle East as it comes to Israel. The first axis is the Iranian axis, second is the Turkish one, and then we have the moderate Arab camp as kind of a bunch of states who I think jump to the conclusion that some notions of the 20th century are not that valid for them, for their politics of survival in the 21st century. Iran is very threatening, of course, and you can hear about that time and again. Look at that, actually, what we got here, again, and I would like actually to make a long story short, is this crescent, which is depicted by Arabs as Hilal al-Shi'i, which is the Shiite crescent. What Iran has managed to do in the recent decades is to capitalize on the ongoing weakness on some Arab neighbors. Lebanon was first, Iraq was second, and in the last decade, actually, Syria came to be seen an easy prey for Iran, as to create kind of a corridor being stretched from the Persian Gulf, as the Persians would depict it, to the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. Now, this is a fait accompli. States like Lebanon are not kind of a normal states. They have been kidnapped one way or the other by Iran through proxies like Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is not kind of a pro-Iranian militia only. It has a hand in Lebanese politics, economics, indoctrination, education, etc. And the same goes to Iraq, Syria. One would say also when it comes to Yemen, this is the same story. But for the sake of our discussion, what Iran has managed to create is kind of a corridor, as I said before. I mean, maybe we could just talk about crescent. And this is why many Arab states, by the way, actually invented the premise of what they call Iranian threat, al-Khatar al-Irani. Many in Israel would think that this is kind of an idiom which was brought in by Israel, but basically in tandem with Israel, many Arab states actually came to see this Iranian bid for hegemony as kind of a thing which becomes very, very threatening to the whole region, including many Arab states. I think that tomorrow you're going to see that guy is becoming the new president of Iran. And this is kind of a complementary to the vicious troika, which has to do with the president, revolutionary guards, and the supreme leader. And of course, we are at a stage where many questions are still remains to be seen how they're going to be answered or responded. The main thing is, of course, the deal with Iran, and it has to do with the Biden administration. We do see now sort of a stalemate when it comes to that. It seems that Iran thinks that it has now the upper hand for many reasons. I won't delve into too many details about that, but looking at the way actually Iran is acting in the Middle East, its modus operandi, one should definitely assess that what we got here is a sort of a more militant and tough or tougher kind of a policy, by which once again to put some teeth into its bid for hegemony. There's a lot to be said about Iran, but basically this has become kind of part and parcel of Middle Eastern geopolitics. The agony of some Arab states like Lebanon and Iraq are being, I think, used or capitalized by Iran. And as I said before, actually, we have those Arab states. It is as if we are still with Arab states, which seems for the, outsider as kind of normal states with boundaries, flags, etc. But that is not true. Practically, they are being controlled after the model of state within a state by Iran. And this is a very, very vicious circle from which I don't think Lebanese and Iraqis can get rescued. The other axis is being run by this guy, Recep Erdogan, and Turkey is becoming another very, very influential power in the region, maybe less than Iran. But once we are dealing with this whole ideology of pious Sunni Islam, which is
Uzi,
yes, sorry.
could you just zoom in on the PowerPoint into presentation mode for us?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Is that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so now let's just get back. This is the map. Here we have the different, camps, axis, whatever. This is the Shiite crescent. Here comes the new guy, actually, Ibrahim Raisi. Starting from tomorrow, he's going to be the president. And this is what I said about actually growing radicalization of this regime, in spite of the agony that many, many Iranians do suffer from the, set of priorities of this cynical and cruel regime. And I just started to talk about Turkish Recep Erdogan. 20 years have passed. This guy actually has managed to change Turkey and from scratch almost, actually create kind of a religious autocracy at the expense of the legacy of Ataturk, by which to create Turkey in the 20th century as a secular state. Of course, we do see Turkey here and there. It's not only the notion of the Muslim brothers. The one who knows actually what's going on in Europe and in the States would say a lot about the way actually those Muslim brothers actually becoming very, very influential when it comes to state and societies in these parts of the world. But this is not our topic today. One way or the other, Erdogan is behind to some extent these venture. And I think that he is becoming kind of a tough nut when it comes to many Arab states too. Look at Libya, for example. This is Tripoli, this is Benghazi. These are two different, of course, governments. Erdogan, not surprisingly, is supporting the Tripoli government in order to get kind of a foothold in the Mediterranean. So if you go to Benghazi, you would see Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, even tiny Bahrain supporting Khalifa Haftar, who is running against Tripoli. And this is kind of a classic proxy war that could tell you a lot about the spirit or the atmosphere, geopolitical atmosphere in the Middle East. Take, for example, neighboring Syria to Turkey. This region in the northeastern edge of Syria has become sort of a security zone that had been swallowed up by Turkey in order to settle the scores with many, many Syrian Kurds and create once and for all kind of a different reality on the ground, which is much, much more comfortable for Turkey in order to have that. Syria, by the way, is another microcosm that could tell you a lot about the destiny of this Arab state. Turkey is here. Iran is in the east of Syria, trying to get a foothold in the Golan Heights down there. Here is Israel actually trying to prevent them. This is the reason for all these skirmishes and incidents you hear time and again. Actually, this is kind of an ongoing and steady attempt by Israel to prevent Iran from building up sort of a post in the Golan Heights, thereby creating another border with Israel, or sitting back to back to Israel on top of Lebanon, having that from Syria. And of course, when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, one should take into account that Latakia and Tartus, the main ports of Syria, are being controlled by the Russians. And, having mentioned Russians actually are feeling in the vacuum that was left behind by a so-called American withdrawal from the region. We'll have to wait and see. but one should say loud and clear in 2021, this is the first time after 200 years where Western presence in this region is very hesitant and very pale. Instead of that, what we got is kind of a Russian incursion and of course a Chinese penetration, economically speaking, which is creating by itself kind of a different equation with which players in the Middle East actually have to deal with. But this is the oxymoron, this is the paradox. Iran and Turkey used to be in the 20th century a sort of friends of Israel, pro-Western states. It was Iran's Shah, a monarchy, and Ataturk and his followers. They thought to be or were perceived by anybody as kind of a great hope of the Middle East, thereby Israel, while actually orchestrating its foreign policy, took kind of a slice of comfort by aligning itself with Turkey and Iran then in order to, let's say, deal better or better deal with the Arab threats. What we got now in the 21st century is the opposite. Turkey and Iran became kind of bitter foes when it comes to Israel and some Arab states. And here is the result. Many Arab states, actually, not because they become Zion lovers or whatever, but because they came up with kind of a very accurate calculus after having seen actually what Iran and Turkey, not let alone ISIS and Al-Qaeda, are up to. They have decided to actually come up with sort of a U-turn. This is the Abraham Accord, which is, in my opinion, very, very important when it comes to the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East. We got kind of a normalization agreements with both United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Morocco is another party of that, Sudan too. Well, I mean, albeit in different level, one should actually take into account that these states have decided one way or the other not to adopt the model which is being suggested by Muslim brothers in Turkey, let alone Shi'i Iran. Of course, when it comes to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they were going after them or for them. So paradoxically speaking, those states actually who were pretty sure 100% in the 20th century that Israel is the a problem or the main problem, the only problem through which actually to better analyze the Middle East. Now they came to an understanding that Israel is definitely not the enemy. Some of them actually went as far as to argue that if Israel is not the enemy, and if Israel is the enemy of the enemy, and Israel could definitely come up with some, let's say, gadgets, which are very typical to the 21st century, like renewable energies and stuff. So they actually took the whole base in order to foster normalization agreements. And this is how we are coming up in 2020, 2021 with kind of a geopolitical, let us say, posture of the Middle East, which is highly different from the one we used to have in the 20th century. Now, it is very, very interesting to see how this pandemic thing and the coronavirus was being merged with all these geopolitical considerations. It went without saying that when it comes to the bad guys, now Iran, Turkey, to some extent, Palestinians.
Uzi, sorry, can you please wrap it up in 2 or 3 minutes? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So let me just show you that, and that would be it. Coronavirus, of course, hit the Arab world. Iran mainly suffered and still suffering from that. Everybody's suffering from that. But basically what we have seen here is the way Iran, Turkey, and Palestinians, the way they have pushed many, many reports suggesting that behind the coronavirus, actually, there are some Zionist conspiracies. It had been seen in Iran, in Turkey. Of course, when it came to the Palestinians, this lady, which actually for kind of a short period served as the Minister of Health, suggested that this whole virus is being exported from Israel to the Palestinian territories in order to actually provide a final solution for the Palestinians and diminish them all. Well, we had a lot of that stuff. And of course, coronavirus of normalization was the way the bad guys were actually depicting the normalization agreements Israel actually had brought in or signed on with the states in the Gulf and Morocco. I'll stop here. And if there would be kind of comments, questions in the Q&A discussion, I would love actually dealing with that.
Okay, Uzi, thank you very much for your important presentation to contextualize many of the issues that we're dealing with now. So the final speaker will be Ramy Aziz. And once Ramy is finished, we can open it up to questions. So Ramy, please, a concise presentation, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Thanks,
Okay.
Ramy.
Okay, thank you for giving me this great opportunity to be today here with all of you, and a great opportunity to be in the same panel with Professor Penny Morris and Professor Uzi Rabi. Today I'm going to talk quickly in 10 minutes and have materials. I will illustrate more about what I will present about for another 10 minutes. About the link between what's so-called Palestinian cause and the spreading anti-Semitism. There is a correlation between Palestinian cause as a term and the practice and the spreading anti-Semitism. We will see that through historical overview about the major and the key persons in the political Islam current and the Arab politics scene in general, and how they use the term of Palestinian cause. Before heading to show up the PowerPoint that I have, I need to say that the Jewish presence in historical land of Israel have been started in the late of 18th century. Until the late of the 18th century, from the late of 18th century until the 30s of the 19th century, we haven't the term of Palestinian cause. Why? Because the political Islam current wasn't active enough during this time. But by the Arabic Revolution led by Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini and the help of the Muslim Brotherhood, and after the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna. Could I get the control over the PowerPoint, Daphne, or you will play it? Daphne?
Whatever you prefer, Ramy.
I prefer to get the control.
Cool.
Okay, how I can do it.
Do you want to share?
Yeah, please go ahead.
You can share.
No, go do it and give me the control. Okay. Next photo, please. Okay, here the first important key person in implementing the term of Palestinian cause is Hassan al-Banna. Hassan al-Banna is Egyptian. He's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. He found out a very difficult time when he founded his group in Egypt, because he was a leader of marginalized people and poor people. He can't find out his way between the political elite in Egypt. So Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, is the next photo, please, realizes that this is Al-Din al-Qassam, the next one. Al-Banna, as Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Al-Quds, realized that the Muslim Brotherhood will help him so significantly to carry out his agenda and support the Nazi effectively. So Amin al-Husseini give al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood significant support and the money and unlimited support in different aspects. So the Muslim Brotherhood started to move between the Egyptian using the term of Palestinian cause. We have to support our brother and sister in Palestine, and they are facing the Zionist coming from around the world, supported by colonial power like Britain, Great Britain. So from the 30s of the last century, the conflict between Israeli and the Palestinian started to be, like Professor Benny Morris said, something religious, something pan-Arabism, something moved to be in Arab world level, not only domestic issues like what happened before from late of 19th century, 18th century until the 30s of the last century. And the first serious clashes happened by Izzeddin al-Qassam in 1935. It continues for a few months, but from my opinion, it was considered the first jihadi movement, the first jihadi serious action against the Jewish people based on religion, because Izzeddin al-Qassam, who is a Syrian teacher, came from Syria to Israel, and after that he mobilizes Arab and Palestinian people and even people from Syria, from Lebanon, from Jordan, to take a jihadi action against not only Jewish people, not only British people, but even those from Palestine who are working closely or cooperate with the Jews or with the British. So the next photo, please. Let us back again to Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Amin al-Husseini, after the field of the Great Revolution in 1936 until 1939, escaped to Iraq, and from Iraq to Iran, from Iran until he met with Hitler in Germany. He worked closely with the Nazis to empower the Nazis in the Arab world, to recruit the religion, to as a motivation makes the Muslims from the Gulf to the ocean adopt and support the Nazi states to get over their bullets against the United States, UK, and the other allies. Here, the term of Palestinian cause played a fatal important role. Why? Because he mixed here between the national feelings and the religion feelings and make it something holy. So we asked the Muslim around the world to make a kind of action of jihad against the Jewish people, against the Zionists, and at the same time he argues the Nazis to eliminate the Jewish in Europe much as they can, because he told them, we as Arab tested, we as a Muslim tested them a long time ago. We know that the Jewish people are not evil, they are the source of the evil. And in his diaries, he mentioned in one of his talk with the head of SS, Himmler, he told him that there is only two people can understand the reality of Jewish in this in this planet, the Nazis and the Islamists. Why I focus on this relationship between what the Al-Husseini said about there is only two people can understand how the Jews are harmful, the Nazis and the Muslim. Because after that, could you please move in? Because after here Al-Husseini, while he do Nazi salute to the Muslim troops, he have been succeeded to recruit from Bosnia. Please move forward. Said Qutb, we'll talk about him later. But because later the Islamists played the same role with the left, with the leftists, they said we are only the people who can understand the reality of the Jewish people. So here, what I wanted to say is that the Islamists replaced the Nazis with the extreme leftists later. Another person who played a very important role in formalization the concept of Palestinian cause and linked it to the jihadi action is Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb, in his famous book, Our Battle with the Jews, he described that all the Muslims around the world should to fight against the Jewish people wherever they are, because it's a holy duty. It's farida. It's a holy duty. It's order from the God to annihilation the Jewish people, because Jewish are not the source of evil. They are the evil. Please move forward. And here is Abdullah Azzam. Here, Abdullah Azzam in 80s. Abdullah Azzam is a Palestinian. He was born in Gaza Strip, and he received his education in Al-Azhar University in Egypt. He got his doctorate in education, and after that, he joined the jihadi troops in Afghanistan during the 70s of last century. Abdullah Azzam, after the end of the war between the Afghani people and jihadi and Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, he decided to carry out international jihadi entity. And he was a mentor of Osama bin Laden. He had succeeded to get money from Osama bin Laden and wish his brain, and after that he carried out Al-Qaeda. So Abdullah Azzam, as a Palestinian, he is the real man who created Al-Qaeda, not Osama bin Laden. And he recruited the Palestinian cause, and the slogan of Palestinian cause, the jihad in the sake of Palestinian and liberation, Al-Aqsa Mosque, to attract young people across the world from different countries to Al-Qaeda, and he have succeeded in that. After that, for sure, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri has...
Ramy, you have 5 minutes to finish up.
Okay, 5 minutes. Okay. Here we have a Qaradawi, and we know Qaradawi, Charles talking about him. Please move forward. And Ismail Haniyeh is the head of Hamas movement. Please move forward. Here, Ismail Haniyeh was Yusuf al-Qaradawi in Doha, again, please. And here was Khamenei in Iran. There is a kind of contradiction, as Professor Uzi Rabi said. They working with the Shia Sunni as mercenaries. They need their money, again, please. With Erdogan in Turkey, with Amir Tamim in Qatar, again. Here is Hassan Nasrallah. You can move forward, no problem. You can move, because we have some videos, but I need to stop here about justice for Palestine students in the West, because they are very important. They're using the slogan of Palestinian cause to attract the young people in the West. They have no idea about what happened in the Middle East to their side, not only to get their support, but even to get their money. And they send the money after that to Gaza. So all what happened in the West, from the justice for Palestine, as a student in the campuses, to support the terrorist entity of Hamas, not to support the Palestinians. So we need to separate between Palestinian cause and between Hamas. And at the end, we find out that there is nothing called Palestinian cause, all it about Hamas and support this terrorist group. Please move forward. Move forward. Move forward. Again. Here is justice for Palestine. Gaza. Palestine is using just like a slogan, but the reality is they are support Gaza. And here is a screenshot from, please move forward. Here is a screenshot from one of their Facebook pages. They have been succeeded to collected about 1.538 million euros for their campaign. Please move forward. We have here some videos if you like to watch it. We'll explain more about the relationship between Palestinian cause and anti-Semitism.
Make sure the volume is on.
Daphne.
You might need to unmute Daphne, maybe.
Okay, we can read the subtitles.
Yeah, he's in Arabic anyway, so. Okay, the next one, if we have time.
Ramy, who was that and why is he important?
Yeah, this is Sheikh Muhammad Hassan Yaqub. He's a leader of a Salafi Jihadi currently, not only in Egypt, in Arab world. And he confirmed that even if the Jewish people left Palestine, we have to kill them. We have to follow them. It's not about the land. It's a religious war between us and them until we annihilated all of them at the end. So, so Palestinian cause, so Palestinian cause here about occupation and this slogan is nothing. They are seeking, you know, here our dear friend the Qaradar.
I'll just before you play it, this is the founding director of the Board of Trustees of the Islamic Studies Center at Oxford University.
Yeah, you can imagine.
سلط عليهم طوال التاريخ من يؤدبهم نتيجة إفسادهم. آخر تأديب كان تأديب هتلر، ما فعل بهم وإن كان مبالغوا في الأمر ما بلغوا، ولكن استطاع أن يعني يوقفهم عند حدودهم، وكان هذا أدبا إلهيا، تأديبا إلهيا عقابا قدريا لهؤلاء. والمرة القادمة إن شاء الله ستكون على أيدي المؤمنين. كل ما أتمناه في ختام كلمتي هذا أن يهيئ الله لي في ختام حياتي فرصة للذهاب إلى أرض الجهاد والمقاومة على كرسي متحرك، فأطلق رصاصة على أعداء الله اليهود ويطلقون علي قنبلة أختم بها حياتي بالشهادة وأقول الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
The next video is important. Why? Because he.
Ramy, I think you have to wrap it up.
For a student,
Please.
Short video, please, because you know.
Okay, go ahead. You have 1 minute. Go ahead.
Go ahead. The last one. You know why? Because from Canada, Justice for Palestine, they are speaking English different from what said in Arabic for the people here. No, that's the one. No.
The other one?
That's the other one because this is important, but there is no time. You know.
Chants, y'all. I know that some folks don't know these chants, and that's okay. But we're gonna be super loud for the liberation of Palestine. So let me hear y'all say, "Billah, bidam, nafdik ya Aqsa." Billah, bidam, nafdik ya Aqsa. Billah, bidam, nafdik ya Palestine. Billah, bidam, nafdik ya Aqsa. Billah, bidam, nafdik ya
Okay, you can stop here. No problem. Yeah, what she said in English is completely different from what she said in Arabic. In English, she talking about Palestine, liberation, what's going on. And in Arabic, she's talking about Gaza, and with blood and soul, we will sacrifice to save Al-Aqsa Mosque and to save Gaza. So at the end, the conclusion is all what happened about Palestinian cause now in the West, run by the Muslim Brotherhood, empowered by Turkey, empowered by the money from Qatar, and seeking for support the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza Strip. Nobody is caring about Palestinian people. Nobody is caring about what's so-called the Palestinian cause. There is only focus about the Muslim Brotherhood and support Gaza Strip. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ramy. Ramy, thank you very much. So thank you to Ramy and all, and Benny and Uzi. We now have about 20 minutes for questions. Please raise your electronic hands, and I will ask you. You'll get time to ask the question or make a comment. You're free to comment as well. And anybody in this room would like to ask a question? Okay. Any questions? Okay, Philip, please ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Small. And Ramy, so good to see you, my friend. Thank you very much for your presentation as well. And the question that I had, perhaps either you, Ramy, or Dr. Small might be able to respond to. Dr. Small, you mentioned as Ramy began playing one of the videos that the individual was, and I was not able to get it typed up quick enough, but I believe founding director of some program at Oxford. Could you give me those details so that I can have them for my notes, please?
So Yosef Kawadawi was the director of the Board of Trustees of the Islamic Studies Center when it was launched in Oxford. He's head of the Muslim Brotherhood and calls on believers to complete the work of Hitler, as you saw.
Let me, could I add something to Philippe, Charles, please? Philip, nice to meet you. Long time we didn't see you since I was in Dallas. Yusuf Qaradawi is the godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood around the world, especially in the West. He, about 20 years ago, he bought a new constitution of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West. He told them we should to lift the language of violence much as we can, and we have to consider as Europe is the house of the call, house of the da'wah, you know, not house of the war anymore, because if we take in any violence of action of violence against them, they will respond with the same. So we need to change Europe in silent mode, if I can say that. Among what? Through the education, through the campuses. So he chose a prestigious university like Oxford to establish Islamic studies centers to be a good platform to work through and spread the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you for your question, Philip. I see Kane, you have a question, please feel free.
Yeah, first I'd like to thank the three presenters for them. Good presentations, they were really interesting. But my specific question is for Professor Uzi Rabi. And I agreed with him with what he said about the Abraham Accords, that being vital for advancing peace in the region. But I wondered what his thoughts were on the popularity of these accords among like the general population of the countries. So I know like there were protests in Sudan at the accords when they were signed, and I just wondered what his thoughts were on this, and if he thinks they're like maybe a seedbed for like future issues of maybe like future protests that are trying to reverse the accords.
Well, thank you, Kane. I mean, I think Sudan is kind of a quite iffy question. What we got in Sudan is kind of an ongoing struggle between the civilian establishment and the military establishment, with the military establishment actually siding for going to the Abraham Accords with Israel or normalization agreement with Israel. And when it comes to the civilian establishment, which is being supported by some, let's say, ideologies that were there for ages and were very, very prevailing, the educational curricula, This is something that I do agree with you when it comes to Sudan. But here is the thing, when it comes to United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, tiny as they are, but very, very rich, this is a top-down affair. And having been there quite a time, I can tell you that people in these states do not question actually this whole thing, because basically people there are pretty business oriented, and they do think that when it comes to their own states, it would be for, I think, actually kind of collaboration with Israel would definitely benefit both sides, especially when it comes to the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. I have mentioned those renewable energies and some other gadgets that do belong to the 21st century. This is a very powerful factor when it comes to states who do depend on oil industry, which is going one way or the other, to be either depleted or become of secondary importance. So I think that the Abraham Accords, at least when it comes to the Gulf states and to some extent Morocco, is kind of a multi-layered alignment or alliance with Israel. It is not only being built up on the geopolitical dimension, which says that my enemy's enemy can be my friend. It is having sort of a very solid bilateral bond, which is very, very useful and essential for both states' future. And I think that this is the reason why we should consider such agreements as kind of sign of hope, even if those states are doing that, as I said before, because they are very, very, they found themselves in a predicament after having kind of a Middle East where you have, you know, kind of horrors and suffering and whatever. And this is something which is very typical for Arab states in the 21st century. Everybody for itself. They are doing their own particular calculus, and this is the reason why they are coming up with that. I do think that this is something of great importance, and I do hope that this would pave at least partially a way for a different Middle East in the 21st century.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment here from Haris Rafiq.
Hi, Ramy. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to elaborate on something that's been said already. Yusuf al-Qaradawi isn't the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. He is the spiritual head. The actual head is Muhammad Badi, as Ramy will know. Yeah, he is the head. So sometimes he gets an easy ride because he's not out there in everybody's face, whereas Qaradawi is. That's very important because Qaradawi is an old man and he still is important to them. But Badi and his team are really the brains. But I just wanted to elaborate on something. I just wanted to build on something very quickly that Ramy said. That exactly at one time they used to call Europe as Dar al-Kufr or Dar al-Harb, the land of war, the land of Kufr. And what they've now done is called it Dar al-Dawa, the land of proselytization. But there's a reason for it. And the reason is very, very clear. They really have three key aims to what they want to do. The Dar al-Dawa is really around taking control of certain key political organizations. They've taken control more or less of the Labour Party and have had control of the Labour Party for a while through Momentum and partnerships in the UK. Through entryism, they will make partnerships with organizations. At one time, it would have been clear and correct to say that the Muslim Brotherhood were an anti-communist party, even though Qatar was a Marxist at one time, but they were very clear on how they were anti-communism. However, not now. They will make partnerships with anybody and everybody in order to do what? To take control of key political institutions and organizations. Why? They don't really care that much about the UK, US, Europe, etc. Everything really is around the region in the Middle East. That's what they're really focused on. What do they want to do? They want to gain capacity, build political alliances, so that force pressure through the numbers of people that join them and politics to take control over one country, somewhere in the Middle East. And then third point is to spread that around the world. They have changed tactics recently. Ramy is absolutely right. And a lot of these tactics they've taken over, or rather they've adopted from an organization that actually spun off from them, and that's Hizb ut-Tahrir. This is very similar to Hizb ut-Tahrir's tactics. So I think it's important to realize why they're doing what they're doing, and what the overall aim is. And violence will be there at some stage. And Mohammed Badi is somebody we mustn't underestimate. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Charles.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Ramy.
Charles, quickly, I have to comment. Now is the real head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Badi, in the jail for a long time. Now is the real head in London, Ibrahim Munir. I think Rafiq knows him in person, maybe. Ibrahim Munir recently chosen to be the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Hizb ut-Tahrir, by the way, also founded by Taqiyuddin al-Nabhani in Palestine in the 50s of last century by a Palestinian guy. So most of the problem and the Islamists come from Palestine.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So London is an interesting place. Okay. Anybody else with a question? David Patterson, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And thank all three of you for yet another excellent panel. I have a question for Uzi. And it's good to see you again, Uzi.
Great to see you, David.
You mentioned Sudan, and you know far more about Sudan than I, so I'm asking you. Sudan emerged under the influence of the Brotherhood through Hassan al-Turabi, followed by Omar al-Bashir, and I was a little taken aback that Sudan would sign on to the Abraham Accords, or would be interested in it. So to what extent does the thinking of the Brotherhood continue to influence the thinking of the Sudanese leadership?
Oh, well, it is still there, but to some extent, what we are trying actually here to say, that when it comes to the post-Omar al-Bashir Sudan, this is the most important thing. This is a Sudan that was actually blacklisted by the US, and here is the prize for this normalization agreement. They are going actually to be out of the list, so to speak. And this is something that was very attractive for, let's say, the military echelons, while trying actually to make their position stronger in Sudan and create kind of different direction for the state. Yes, we do talk about the post-Omar al-Bashir period. There are remnants of that there. And I wouldn't say that they are just few and far between, but this is a struggle actually Sudan is experiencing. And I do hope, as I said before, listen, I mean, nobody has become a Zion lover, as I said in my presentation. Everybody has to get something or to be benefited from that. Morocco got a kind of an autonomy on the Western Sahara for that. United Arab Emirates got this very, very well advanced airplane from the United States, the F-35. But here is the thing. States are coming up with a particular calculus. Most of them came to the conclusion that all these notions of the 20th century are good for nothing if they would like to really have a different future for themselves and for the next generations. If they are, this is exactly actually the direction. And once again, I'm not talking about intimacy, not true love, not even friendship. What I do talk about is the convergence of interests between Israel and those states. And here is what I think: a clever and wiser Israel in the 21st century would map them out and create kind of an understanding of how my interest could be merged with his in order to actually make it sort of a benefit for both parties. It has to do with Sudan, it has to do with Morocco, definitely with the United Arab Emirates, definitely with Bahrain, and look at Egypt, look at Jordan. These states are fighting for their own survival. Not to mention states like Lebanon who went into oblivion. So Arab states are coming up with something which is the opposite to this collectiveness that used to be here in the 20th century. And I think that a wiser Israel could capitalize on that. This is why I said it's kind of a new geopolitical chessboard. We have to make the most of it. There are fierce challenges, definitely, but there are some pros to be actually pros and cons, and there are some things that could be advantages for Israel if a wiser Israel could just capitalize on them.
Thank you. So we have a little bit of time left. Thank you. We have a bit of time left. So I'm going to ask a question to Benny, and I see Max, you have your hand up. So when I finish asking my question, before anybody responds, please ask your question. So they'll collect the questions, and then Benny will lead off. And if Uzi or Ramy have anything to add, feel free. So my question to Benny. So Benny, the conversation so far, I think, had a contemporary focus. There was sort of your historical analysis of 1948, and Ramy and Uzi looked at Ramy looked at the history of the Muslim Brotherhood. Ramy looked at Uzi looked at the geostrategic map in the contemporary context. Benny, your work on 1948 as jihad. How do you see your historical analysis kind of matching up to the contemporary challenges of the Brotherhood and these sort of reactionary social forces? So that's my question to you, Benny. And then Max, please ask your question concisely, and then we'll let the speakers respond.
Hi, yeah, pardon me. Thanks to all three speakers, all really interesting talks, but I think my question's aimed towards Remy. When we hear chants that we just heard on the last video, the Canadian pro-Palestine march, are we to assume that the word occupation is a euphemism for the state of Israel rather than illegal occupations in Palestinian land? Is that how we're supposed to treat that word generally, like a euphemistic term, rather than its actual meaning? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So Benny and then Ramy. Sorry, Benny, you're muted.
Religion is much more important in the Middle East among Arabs than it is in the West among Westerners, and many in the West don't understand that. Most Arabs, I would say quite bluntly, believe in God. They believe in Allah. They believe that religion is important, that God controls the destinies of men and of nations. And Westerners, of course, don't see things that way, most Westerners, and therefore they don't really understand the Middle East. Religion has always played an important part in Middle Eastern politics and in its geopolitics, and will continue to do so. Maybe the geopolitics of the Middle East will change a little bit, or refashioning themselves because of the Iranian Sunni conflict, but religion will still remain a basic driving force among most Arabs. And I'm not sure that's going to change things that much. And Islamic doctrine has it that the Jews are the enemy of Islam. And until there's a basic shift in that, as it existed in 48 among the Arabs, I think it still exists. And if there's no basic shift in this understanding of the Jew as infidel, of the Jew as the enemy of Islam, I'm not sure the Middle East is really going to change that much.
Thank you. And Ramy, very concisely, please.
Yeah, very concisely. As I understand from Max, he talking about the difference between occupation and this stuff. Listen, as Professor Benny Morris just said, religion is very important in the Middle East, and even very important for the Middle Eastern people abroad. And when we are talking about the Middle Eastern communities, I will not say Muslim communities, but majority of Middle Eastern communities are Muslim. It's a religion is a matter for them in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, wherever they are. So they are promoting the Palestinian cause as a liberation movement. They are promoting Hamas not as a terrorist movement. They are promoting as a liberation movement to mobilize the people to be in their side. But in reality, it's not working like that. When you are support Hamas, when you pay your donation to the Justice Student for Palestine in many campuses in Canada and the United States, it will end up in the hands of terrorist movement in Gaza Strip, and they will send it to Malali regime and Mullah's regime in Iran to send them rockets, and after that they will fire it in innocent people in Tel Aviv and other city of Israel. So that is the point. That is the mechanism how it's working. It's not a liberation movement. It's a terrorist movement, and the people should to differentiate between a Palestinian people and what's called the Palestinian cause and the Hamas movement and Gaza Strip. Why there is nobody of those people in Canada and the United States talking about what happened for the Palestinian and the suffer of Palestinian innocent people with Mahmoud Abbas in what's called the West Bank? Because they are not belongs to them. They are not a Muslim Brotherhood like them. They are talking and care only about the Muslim Brotherhood, and they collecting and raising money only for the Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah. So we need to speak up loudly inside the campuses, because campuses and university is the most hot points, effective points, and important arena for working for these groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramy. And also, Max, very quickly, in response to your question, when they're singing from the river to the sea, they're speaking about the elimination of all of what is Israel, not just the territories, the disputed territories. And this is very much in keeping with the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. You cannot have a situation where citizens of different religions or backgrounds are equal to a Muslim. Jews, Christians, others have to be lower than the Muslim in the caliphate. And even if Israel was just Tel Aviv, if Jews and Muslims and Christians and men and women were equal, it would be a problem for the Muslim Brotherhood and for Hamas. So they're talking about the elimination of Israel, and this is becoming the rhetoric in universities and on the streets of Western democratic cities and capitals. Okay, so on behalf of everybody, Ramy, Uzi, and Benny, thank you so much for participating and putting your wisdom out and your education and knowledge of these very complicated issues. So thank you very